Questions surrounding the revelation of the Quran are numerous, and so are the arguments for and against its divine status. It's been called a miracle, and for many, its credibility rests entirely on the manner of its preservation, the chains down which it's been passed since its revelation. But is this defensible? When we ask why it's a miracle, the arguments we find are not truly rooted in the text itself, but in the historical context of its revelation, i.e. its historicity, that is, the chain of events collated and edited by major Islamic exegetes. In short, this is the tradition, a massive literary and cultural incubus erected around the Quran, functioning like buffer zones, insulating it from questions that, while they may seem to merely poke at the book, are truly important and need to be asked. One such question is the divine status of the Quran. What is really miraculous about it? Here we encounter two major arguments. The first is what's known as concordism, which is the habit of harmonizing and reconciling ideas found in works like the Quran or the Bible, by interpreting them in ways that align with modern scientific discoveries or theories. An example would be reinterpreting the Quranic cosmology in terms of theories like the Big Bang, or adjusting the history of mankind in ways that accords, directly or indirectly, with modern anthropology. This is often done because of the immense success of the scientific method and the educational, industrial, and economic structures erected on the back of the revolutionary research in the hard sciences. So successful has the scientific method proven that its approach, one of detached objectivity, has been applied to subjects requiring things like history, lived experience, tradition, culture, etc. The humanities, literature, history, and the so-called soft sciences have been eclipsed by the former, and experiment, observation, and construction have taken the place of philosophizing, poetics, and other lesser-known areas of this field. Unfortunately, the Quran has not been spared the encroachments of concordism. Even as it kept its structure, words, and compositions intact, having absorbed the framework of the modern scientific view of the universe, approaches the book convinced that the stars to which the Quran refers, in numerous places, are the same exploding objects in deep space discussed in school textbooks. This is an unconscious form of concordism, as shown in the neglect of considering that the stars of modern cosmology are not necessarily what they're purported to be. Not to mention a dozen other ideas around the history of man, biology, and language, all of which bolsters the concordist view. These views, however successful their model's been, cannot be used to interpret the Quran. We cannot use a source external to the Quran to prove its consistency, for that clearly defeats the purpose. This is the same error we see on the side of tradition, where the credibility of the Quran almost entirely rests on the credibility of the traditional material, a non-Quranic source. And though those things are important to some degree, and the humanities as a field of inquiry is nested in culture, tradition, and lived experience, the Quran requires none of these as strict epistemological conditions, but merely as a field in which examples can be found, and ideas verified. And although we argue against concordism, we only do so insofar as the uncritical acceptance of scientific theories as a receptacle into which the Quranic mold, as it were, is poured. We strictly differentiate between scientific theories and the scientific method, and argue that the Quran demands the scientific method, the method exemplified in the Meditations of Descartes, the logic of Mill, the critiques of Kant, of induction and detached objectivity. It requires starting afresh from simple given concepts and, with the aid of reason, working out the material contained therein. This is what the book demands as its preconditions. The tradition, though rich and is not to be missed, is nonetheless stiffened by generations-old dogma, which would impede the researcher by offering ready-made answers, interpretations, and expositions, all of which falls upon the individual to pursue and derive. It's strange and noteworthy that the same epistemological problems faced on both sides, the concordist side and the traditionist side.
us to think about. And the first of them is actually the Quran's argument itself. In my own study of the Quran, I grappled with this issue maybe 12, 13 years ago. And when I did, I realized that some of the strongest arguments, probably the most conclusive arguments in favor of the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sunnah, the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, is actually the Quran itself. An in-depth study of the Quran leaves you with no other conclusion but to rely and to acknowledge the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. I would even consider it inseparable from the Quran, or a part of the study of the Quran, not even a separate institution by itself. It's actually part and parcel and inseparable from the Quran. And so I want to share some of that with you, inshallah, how that works. The first case that I want to share with you is that this is not a new criticism.
But what is the alternative, you may ask? We answered this in the last video when we said that, as far as the Quran is concerned, the proof is in the pudding. Here, we couldn't approach the book except by the book itself. There's no way around the direct study of the text. The proof of this claim can only be found within the text itself. The same goes for claims regarding the preservation of the Quran. The answer cannot be a mere reference to the names of people in some chain of narration. Instead, we must demonstrate that the text is preserved by laws that holds its structure together, and can do so in no other way than the way we see it. This means applying the principle of sufficient reason of the Quran, and specifically the criterion of necessity. Why should it be this way and no other way? We here stress testing the book. If it was constructed so as to last for eternity, then like an engineer designing a bridge, he seeks the best possible way to construct it. The most cost-effective way, using the resources and materials, the technology available for him. He factors in everything, of direct and indirect implication. He considers every variable that may arise and potentially compromise his project. And though far from omniscient, he knows and confides in himself the thought that, if given enough knowledge, he could build the best possible bridge that could ever be built. He knows this by projection, often through exponential growth models and whatnot, from the current state of knowledge and technology, what's possible in the future. He knows that it's a matter of understanding the laws, turning the variables into constants, and making the unpredictable and arcane into computable laws and rules that can be mastered with simple steps. This projection, this confidence that with enough knowledge any problem can be solved, is just another way of posing the question that many scholars within and outside the Islamic tradition have grappled with. By what measure can one hold it to be God's work? How does one know that for sure? What's the criterion? It's here where the confidence with which the natural scientist approaches nature is needed. For if the Quran is as much God's work as nature is, why shouldn't the same rigor and confidence equally apply? God's name, Al-Alim, the all-knowing, means that God possesses the means. Think of them as solutions or applications that can be immediately invoked to effect some result. Knowledge, as previously discussed, is not the facts that one knows, but what, knowing the laws and principles, one could understand, contextualize, predict, and appropriately respond to any contingency that may arise. Extend this to the Quran, and there immediately follows the epistemological rule that grounds the whole text: knowledge as application. But what the apt researcher looks for, and why we say the Quran should be approached scientifically, are the same things which the engineer, the chemist, the physicist, and geologist, and particularly the mathematician, looks for. In a word, problems to solve. The greater the problem, the more foundational it is. But what sort of problems? Structural problems. Problems of method. Armed with the principle of sufficient reason, the researcher seeks, in things, the same definitiveness and necessity as expressed in fluid dynamics. How water shapes itself according to its medium. Proofs analogous to this are what's sought, self-evident proofs. But not even this is evident enough. It's now asked what makes water so dynamic, a question that will have opened the door into molecular dynamics and physical chemistry, and so on. Each question, as Gadamer put it, opens up the being of the thing, and finding this to be true, the scientist stops at nothing, convinced that beneath each layer hides another. And on this basis he approaches the architectonic, the infrastructural, the parameters and criteria of analysis appear by themselves, as if nature was really meant to be revealed to him in exactly the way he understands it. This is important, as this is the presupposition that urges him on. His method is constituted by a heavy reliance on empirical data and their collection. Those are analogous to examples showing aspects of the phenomenon he's researching. Based on this data, he builds a mind map to collate and organize them. He builds theories and models based on them, formulates hypotheses and compares them to each other. The object is to distill the mass of material into the lowest common denominator, i.e. the simplest, most generalizable explanations. There's no comparing the level of intellectual exercise and acumen that goes into science and that applied in religious studies and softer sciences. Not even are the criteria the same, to say nothing of the parameters, for the scientific method, independently of its results, is validated by this fact alone, that its objective simply consists in the discovery of fundamental laws, and in the pursuit of its task, it seeks to check for any presuppositions that might impede progress. In this, it naturally relies on experiment, and to reproduce former results with new means and under different conditions. But to be clear, it's not the purity of the empirical observation that absolves, but the freshness and vivacity with which his mind has to work. With such diversity and obscurity as can be derived from observation, he has no choice but to think and rethink, to doubt and rework the premises of his judgments, rather than sufficing in the claims of authority, as Cassirer put it.
Theory leads to experiment, and decides the character of the experiment, just as experiment determines the content of theory. Ernst Cassirer, Kant's Life and Thought, 1921.
But the cycle of theory and experiment is not reserved for the hard sciences. It's also used in the domain of literature and philology, however with a slight modification. The objects of experiment are other ideas, assertions and claims, wherein the experimental part consists in what Schleiermacher says, understanding the author better than he understood himself. That is, we seek to glean the laws in the morphology of ideas. This can be seen in the rigorous works of A.J. Toynbee, Study of History, Arthur Lovejoy's Great Chain of Being, Spangler's Decline of the West. These are some of the numerous examples of the scientific method being applied in the field of philology and history. Epistemology is taught in the Quran in chapter 2, Al-Baqarah. Moses asks his people, having just left Egypt and finding their way in the world, to slaughter a cow. They are taken aback by this request, wondering if he was being facetious. He replies that he's not. They ask him to ask God to specify what it is, i.e. the cow. He returns with a description of the cow that's mostly been interpreted as referring to the age of the cow. Those words being farid, supposedly meaning old, and bikrun awan, supposedly meaning young. However, some digging into the Quran shows this not to be true. Simply looking at the morphology of these two terms will show it. We found here that farid occurs in many inflections, all of which are in contexts related to duty, occupation, responsibility. A domestic setting, for example, the responsibility of the husband to his wife in cases of marriage and divorce, charity and welfare, customs like upholding prayer, pilgrimage, fasting, and the Quran itself. In all of these cases, farid expresses duty and responsibility, with no reference to age. By Occam's razor, what better interpretation can we ascribe to the expression farid than something in the neighborhood of tasked? We know that in farming, cows are given a variety of jobs, that is, a division of labor among the cows. Cows have been selectively bred over centuries to specialize in certain roles in farms, resulting in different breeds being better suited for specific jobs. This is a form of specialization, or division of labor within cattle farming, based on their natural traits and how they're raised. There are dairy cows, beef cattle, oxen, dual-purpose breeds, breeding and calving, grazing and land management. We can say that a cow that falls within the bracket of farid is tasked with and serves one of these functions. The other mistranslated and misinterpreted word is bikrun awan. This compound word contains bikr and awan. Bikr is actually implied in the use of farid. If farid can mean duty or task, then we may think of bikrun awan as an opposite state. A word like vacant comes to mind. But as we're talking about a species of domestic animals that's never not doing anything, we have to think of a word that, though opposite to farid, still expresses a view towards occupation or task. A good example would be the contrast between a bench player and a field player, where farid refers to the field player and bikrun awan to the bench player. This is a more accurate description of bikrun awan than vacant, as it relays the same thing, but in view of a certain action or occupation, called farid in duty and bikrun awan off duty. Awan actually is an inflection of the familiar term nasta'in from Surah Al-Fatiha. This term means support or resort. Combined with bikr, it produces, in addition to bikr, a view towards occupation or task, a sense of being enlisted, which is the sense we get when, being off work, one clocks back in and rejoins his team. It would seem, from the standpoint of duty and the work one's doing, that one is lending a hand, though one is simply clocking back in. A very precise expression. Think about it. Thus the term bikr is a term that, when used in conjunction with farid, expresses occupation or work as a possibility. It's an anticipation of some function that one's been doing and one continues to return to. Thus we can say generally that cows are divided into classes: in duty, off duty, and a class that awaits assignment.
This case is exemplified in the situation of Moses, who, having fled Egypt, found himself by a tree in a strange land. He finds the people watering their herd, and he finds there 2 women in need of help. He lends them a hand, then returns to the shade, and as a reward for what he's done, he is to be hired by the father of these women in exchange for marrying one of them. فَسَقَى لَهُمَا ثُمَّ تَوَلَّى إِلَى لَلظِّلِّ فَقَالَ رَبِّي إِنَّ لِمَا أَنزَلْتَ إِلَى مِنْ خَيْرٍ فَقِيرٍ. So he watered their herd for them, then withdrew to the shade and prayed, "My Lord, I am truly in desperate need of whatever provision you may have in store for me." Quran 28:24.
This is a very good demonstration of that in-between state. بين ذلك. Again, there's the guy on the pitch, the guy on the bench, and the guy trying to join the team. The guy trying to join the team would be in between in this context. Thus you'll find cows that have not been allocated any definite task, cows that are being evaluated to determine where they would fit in the overall farm operation, whether as beef cattle, dairy cattle, or for other specific purposes. Once the evaluation is done, and a cow in the transitional phase is determined to be suited, best for dairy, let's say, it then enters that phase to which the term bikrun awan would apply. Here the cow is imnished into the dairy cattle routine, though not yet lactation ready and is called dry. Nonetheless, it's being prepared so as to be lactation ready. If it's a beef cattle, then a different routine would apply, i.e., given a certain diet and the like. Now the term bayna in bayna dhalik does in fact mean in between. But in what sense? Like the example just given, it's that which belongs to a sequence of 2 terms, but belongs to neither. In logic, this would be called distribution, or distributivity. In a sense, that which is in between shares a certain relation to a given dyadic or dual sequential relation, whose main components are the sky and the earth. Their function is distributive in that they serve both spheres, or rather, they connect them and make possible the symbiosis between the heavens and the earth. This is only possible if the three constitute one inclusive thing, inclusive in the sense of being reducible to a syllogism. Applying this to our context, we see that the cows in their transitional phase, in being neither farid nor bikrun awan, can be either. They are, in a sense, the pool from which specialized cattle are drafted. It's important that this triadic relation be recognized, as is part of the syllogistic structure of terms, which all the more confirms and exemplifies the intrinsically logical structure of the Quran. Any context in which the expression bayn is used will express the same relation. In the verse, the Israelites ask Moses to ask God to clarify or specify the cow for them. The expression used for clarify or specify is bayna, or bayin. But where's the dual relation, you may ask, that's supposed to be similar to that of the heavens and the earth, in the previous verse where the distributive relation applies?
Typically, the expression between is used to denote a relationship between two entities, such as the clouds between the heavens and the earth. However, in the Quran, this term undergoes a remarkable transformation. It sometimes signifies specification or demonstration. The Quran itself is described as mubin, and God declares in verse 1, chapter 15, that He has taught man bayan. Khalaqa il-insan 3, allamahu al-bayan 4. What then is the in-between in this context? Between what entities does it operate, and how can a term that typically denotes a relationship between things be employed as the predicate? In our verse, the request for specification exemplifies this use of the term as a predicate, particularly as a verb. This usage is distinct from its application to farid, or bekr awan, bikr awan. Yet it reveals a unique linguistic and conceptual depth. We can assert that it's possible for a single object to be treated as two. This involves a negation of the same object, for example, cow and not cow. In this framework, the negation, not cow, parallels the duality observed between bikr awan and fard, representing a view of its opposite. Thus, the negation serves a similar function to bekr awan, highlighting the potential for transformation. Consequently, the cow in the verse, following the negation, is treated as an intensive magnitude that is treated analytically. For this purpose, the logical rule of tautology is a necessary function, as it asserts that a statement is true regardless of the truth values of its components. Tautology reinforces the idea that certain propositions hold consistent validity. Comparative attributes like bikr awan and fard are therefore to be understood as part of the constructive effort of the identity of the cow.
Having two terms, now we can approach the verse with the understanding that, not knowing what sort of cow it is, and wanting to know what sort of cow it is, form a tautology, and therefore a dual relation. The expression bayin represents a way of linking the two in a continuously meaningful structure. Thus the verse is being very specific with respect to the manner in which the request was made, i.e. the semantics of the request as it's being made, and the mood that's dominant in it. Judging from the fact that it's to be multiple requests as specifying the object, bayin articulates the sense of continuous determination, i.e. to keep giving them clues and revelations. This tells us that the expression is trying to capture something of the present feel of the request. Seeing how, in the moment, our objective always assumes this generalized form, it becomes a sort of index, that which is to make these series of steps possible, though it is itself the object of these steps. Thus it's quite logical to posit the possibility of determining the object as the actual request, which is what a request ultimately is. Emphasis is placed on the process of specifying, on sequentially presented specifications, not just one clue and that's it. show me which one it is presupposes subjective conditions, the satisfaction of which gives you the thing. And this is shown in the sequence of verses 68, 69, 70, and 71. Let's call these conditions of the understanding. For what God is teaching the people of Israel here is something pertinent to the intellectual psychology of this nation, as he did in the case of Abraham in Surah Al-An'am, chapter 6, verse 76 to 79, to whom he gave the same test, for, as we see, the same purpose, to stimulate their natural faculty, to induce empiricism, in contrast to what he chastised them for doing, following the charlatan as-Samiri and being led astray. The method used by the charlatan that led him astray was one of chicanery, as he knew exactly what they wanted, and what they themselves didn't know they wanted, and what they themselves did not know they were seeking, and exploited that by means of a device that was either a bull or a ram. The device is noteworthy for the same reason that the cow, as means of instruction, is significant. The difference can be seen in the reactions they exhibited to both animals. With the ram, they reacted sheepishly and with blind credulity, whereas with the cow they reacted critically, with skepticism and inquisitiveness. Recall the self-respect they expressed in response to Moses' request. Are you mocking us? Precisely the way they should have reacted to the charlatan. Clearly, two kinds of ethos are being starkly contrasted. Two forms of the rhetorical triangle are being distinguished, and the same symbolic distinction must be found with respect to the two domestic animals. Comparing these two, it's clear which of them is more productive and yields the most quality. Cows/cattle offer more in terms of meat, milk, and versatility, whereas the ram or sheep offer significantly less than cattle. Another characteristic difference between these is cost. Cattle cost more and are significantly more expensive to raise, feed, and maintain compared to sheep. This is clearly reflected in the story. The path which God had ordained for them was one laden with challenges, costlier and demanding exercise, but which is most rewarding and fruitful, like cattle farming compared to sheep farming, which is much cheaper, more affordable, but yields much less. This comparison aptly applies to self-development, Bildung, what we call the road less traveled, doing those things that, though challenging, involve discipline, patience, study, and growth through challenges. These build the most character, while the commonly traveled road, where one follows what everyone else is doing, yields much less, if anything at all. From an eschatological viewpoint, it's the former that counts, the path that leads to heaven, not the latter.
Finding Moses' description unsatisfying and not descriptive enough, the people ask Moses to be more specific. Call upon your Lord to specify for us its color. He replied, Allah says, it should be a bright yellow cow, pleasant to see. قالوا دعوا لنا ربك يبين لنا ما لونها قال إنه يقول إنها بقرة صفراء فاقع لونها تسر للناظرين. Quran, Doom 69. It's yellow, he returns. Now, why color, and why yellow in particular? The answer is found in the phenomenon of color. Color serves as a critical visual indicator in understanding morphology, the structure and form of living and non-living entities. Throughout natural and scientific observations, changes in color often signal shifts in physical state, development stages, or health conditions. This relationship allows for the intuitive monitoring of morphological changes without specialized equipment. Notably, yellow, being one of the most visibly perceptible colors due to its high luminance and placement near the peak sensitivity of the human eye, often marks preliminary stages in processes. For instance, in the natural world, the initial bright yellow of some fruits indicates immaturity, changing as the fruit ripens. This makes yellow a key color in the early detection and assessment of morphological developments, underscoring its unique role in the broader spectrum of color indicators.
Now, inconsistency with the concept of color and the specific color yellow, we find the term faqi', meaning bright, It adds specificity to the overall scheme. Think yellow but relatively speaking bright or flashy. We obtain the meaning bright by transforming the original meaning of the term waqi', which is an inflection of faqi', and which, on analyzing its use in the Quran, appears to denote recurrence. Think of a pendulum swinging back and forth and stopping on one side or the other before swinging back. A coin toss, heads or tails. An ultimatum, in which only one of two outcomes can materialize. There is something of the confirmation of a given possibility. This confirmational instance would be what the Quran calls waqi'. The sky falling upon the earth in this verse expresses, in addition to the mutual exclusivity of the earth and the heavens, that an event is not to take place until a time which God had preordained, i.e., the end times, an event which he may call premature or having occurred earlier than expected. The pilgrim who dies on his way to the Prophet demonstrates this. The verse makes this very point. Thus, what we see here is an epistemological condition, colors tied to morphology, which in turn is tied to perception. Distinguishing the color factor as part of being acquainted with the object is inextricably tied to its morphological conditions, such as growth and development. Color reflects quality and states of being. The verse intends to show how the Israelites, in their desire for precision, sought not only that which is a natural determiner of the quality of being, but also a specific quality, the color yellow. Two interesting modifications occur here. As noted, the color yellow, as used in the Quran, is employed in a qualitative sense in reference to crops and how, when they wither or dry out, they turn into a state describable as yellow. This shows the reversal of the natural order, confirming the fact that yellow in general denotes the opposite of maturity or ripeness, whether this be a state of prematurity or senescence. But in both cases is expressed a view to ripeness and maturity, regardless on which side of the spectrum it lies on. The same pattern of functional opposition is being expressed that we saw in Farid and Bikrun Awan. Continuing the verse, it seemed that none of these criteria were sufficient enough to identify the cow, as we read in verse 70 that after looking, they still could not distinguish the cow, asking Moses to be even more specific, i.e. narrow down the criteria. It's quite apparent from their response and their request to narrow down the search criteria that the variables were just too many for an effective identification. What they were doing, i.e. the want of specificity, would be what's called falsification in scientific epistemology.
This process of falsification is less about negating a theory and more about exploring how well an idea or criterion holds up under the test of proof. In this light, falsification becomes a measure of sufficiency, which circles back to the principle of sufficient reason. Think of it as a test of rigor. You want to see how far a standard or criterion takes you. The point is not that the search criterion is actually proportional to or sufficient to capture the objective. The merit of falsification rests in the way it modifies our approach to an objective. This isn't something we can know if the whole idea is to test the criterion to its limits. We may surmise that God intentionally gave the Israelites clues that required a great exercise of intellect, so great that the objective might not have been reachable given their state at the time. But the whole point was to get them to exhaust one criterion after another, unknowingly subjecting each criterion to the principle of falsification. Aim for the stars, and you might just land on the moon. Is this not what quizzes and puzzles do, you assume? As you must, the solution to be there? Is this not what the examiner does when he changes the questions in the exam? To make you think that the material you've been studying in preparation was different. Take that feeling you got in most exams and subtract from it the context. And you might just have recreated the feeling which the Israelites felt every time they flocked back to Moses empty-handed.
An vielen, vielen Konsequenzen. Vieles kann man daraus ableiten. Der Nachweis, dass eine dieser Konsequenzen richtig ist, kann nicht nachweisen, dass alle die anderen Konsequenzen richtig ist. Es kann auf diese Weise die Theorie interessanter werden, sie kann sich bewähren, wie der Fachausdruck ist, aber sie kann nicht bewiesen werden. Hingegen hätte die Theorie aber widerlegt werden können, wenn...
It's generally involuntary, but to the scientist, a very powerful instrument of scientific inquiry. One of the objectives of the test is to induce and habituate them to this method, for this is what's properly called the scientific method. Things change in the next verse, the decisive datum, the eureka moment that changed everything and perhaps defined a moment in the history of this nation that stands among its most important. The decisive terms here are Dhalul, Tuthir, Shiyata, and Muslima. Some interpretive work is needed to understand what's really going on. Is the expression of thing more than just a semantic device with no other use but as filler? Can you isolate among the strata of being a mode of being pertaining to nothing but simply being?
Yes, shy refers precisely to this mode, a term that characterizes the most elemental and primal stratum of intellectual activity. It does indeed refer to a simple thing, but thing in the metaphysical sense. This is a thing after everything else has been subtracted from it: body, identity, form, shape, color, etc. A pure intellectual being, a monad, is engendered. It characterizes the most elemental and primal stratum of intellectual activity.
Now, Shiyata is an inflection of shade, but adds something to it. Could it be argued that what determines one's orientation and way of being is something as basal, as undetectably crude as this, or that such a thing even exists?
Yes, and this crude stratum is not only real, but to determine it as active is to make an inclusive and categorical judgment regarding the thing of which it is. In fact, this is where anything is defined in the first place. For the term shay, which, shia, is an inflection of, is equivalent to the Aristotelian enteleki, and is what we really mean when our want of generality and vagueness leads us to use terms like thing or something. We want to describe the most basic sense of our object. Thus, it would be a big mistake to consider an expression like thing to be an indication of vagueness. Though we might think it so, we're in fact trying to define something fundamental about the object of expression, something that is, the definition of which sets the tone for everything that follows.
But when modified into Shiyata, shay acquires something immediately subsequent to shay, a mode of being arising from and operative at a level to which we have no direct access. This is what someone identifies with in the deepest sense. Thus, we want to express acts nested in a level of being that's so defining, so significant a part of one's constitution as to be mistaken for one's nature, though it's not. Thus, when contrasted with the expression musallamatun, it shows how a pure concept, Islam that is, can be ascribed to something non-human. It shouldn't be strange, at this point, knowing that Quranic concepts are natural concepts.
Absolutely. We can thus understand Islam in this natural sense to mean the opposite of, but also equivalent, in the sense that it covers the same stratum of being as shay, i.e., the directive and ethos that one acts out automatically or involuntarily. That it's automatic and involuntary expresses its lofty place in the hierarchy of being.
That this is a quality attributable to the cow has to do with all that's been said about it so far. that it's not farid, in duty, or bikrun awan, off duty, and that it's yellow. These are descriptions reflecting the overall fertility of the cow. The other description for the cow is wala tasqi al-harth, which says that it's not a grazing cattle. Tasqi, in particular, is used in the Quran to mean provisioning or rationing. It does not have to do with watering or irrigation as such, but with land management in general, insofar as land is a resource, or rather the resource of resources. The use of the term in this verse shows this. God carries the clouds to a dead land, like a government sending supplies to an area that has shortage of something. Take also, as an example, Joseph's interpretation of the inmate's dream. The inmate becomes a cupbearer for the king. But this is more than just that. The boy handles wine service in general, supplements, and manages the king's wine provisions. The term primarily denotes that cyclic manner with which something is consumed and required. Applying this meaning to the cow, we immediately see that it does not constitute part of the grazing stock, as must logically be the case if it's not to be farid, in duty, or bikrun awan, off duty. This leads directly to the term tuthir al-ard, where tuthir is used to describe the interaction between the winds and the clouds, or as a proof criterion for divine knowledge that's not from God, or to describe the heights to which some previous civilizations, no longer in existence, have reached. It shows something of the intricacies involved in the manner in which effects, namely beneficial effects, are derived from causal interference. In shaking the tree to get the berries to fall, the bear acts out this principle. When the farmer tills the soil to stimulate the earth, when you water the plants by your window, when a company manager gives an encouraging talk to his employee to get them to work harder, or when you're baking, the water catalyzes the yeast that catalyzes the sugar that catalyzes the flour, which then causes the dough to rise. You consume this and the energy released instantiates the same process in you. Tuthir, in a nutshell, is catalysis, the general term for this causal process. But there's a reason why we want to note this about something, namely, why it's this particular aspect of the cow's function. If the cow were fully tasked, would we make a note of this or not?
If the cow were fully tasked, would we make a note of this? Well, under normal circumstances, we don't take notice of these causal features, especially not for a farmer who manages hundreds of cows. Only if the condition was so exceptional, so out of the ordinary, would we take notice and talk about how this or that happened.
In other words, there must be something truly extraordinary about this cow.
Kind of. Think about it. When there's an inexperienced player on the pitch among other experienced players, we notice aspects of his or her performance that we don't necessarily see in the experienced players. Somehow, because it's irregularities, which is all that an inexperienced player or thing is capable of showing, become expressible in causal terms. The case is likewise if the player shows skills and flashes of brilliance that were not expected. This is what scouting in sports is built around. They look for the extraordinary.
The cow, we read, was engaged in some form of activity, tuthir al-ard, but it need not be, so to speak, in active duty. This is a perfect background to express the idea of precociousness, which we believe tuthir means in this context. In fact, this is the definition of precociousness. How else do you show signs of talent or ability if not by being engaged in the activity itself, albeit at an unofficial capacity?
Well put. The cow would be one showing early indicators of strength and maturity. Precociousness is a perfect term that captures activities that are flashes or predictors of great potential. They are thus as brief as a cause, but as enduring as an effect. The fact that it's the earth that's the recipient of this is a reference to the overall sphere of activity. Again, for the farmer, the earth is the chief resource, thus the domain which the concept tuthera covers in this verse has to do with the domain in which cattle have their function.
Complementing this aspect, we find the expression la dhalul. We find an expression of the process denoted by this term everywhere. Gold, when extracted from the earth, is purified before it can be used. The petroleum that we put in our cars, electricity, must be converted and regulated in order to make it usable. Textile must be cleaned, spun, and woven into fabrics before it can be used for clothing or furnishing. Taming a horse is difficult. It takes time, experience, and patience. The same thing applies to cattle. They too need to be tamed and made comfortable before they can be worked. Dhalul is a term used for this purpose, to modify or transform something in such a way as to render it usable or ready for some task. We read in this verse that the cow is one that's not yet been subjected to this transformation, which is consistent with the fact that it's not yet been tasked with anything, as only when a cow has been sufficiently tamed can it be tasked. What do we take away from this? Why do these two criteria work as opposed to those of color and a cow's work status? Two main concepts, musallama and la shiyata fiha. These two concepts are the defining characteristic because they pertain directly to the purpose of the cow. We know that there can be cows that are uncooperative, having a peculiar temperament, stubbornness, aggression, that greatly diminishes their productivity on the farm. Some of these issues range from
the expression musallamatun, as said, hits the very marrow of one's purpose of being, and this context makes this all the clearer. A cow that has these issues is one whose purpose on the farm is greatly reduced to the point that her obsolescence becomes an ontological matter and strikes at the very purpose of the cow's existence. The concept of Islam thus links the spheres of being and role, function, to the point of inseparability. La shiyata fiha tells us that the calf is pure in this respect by not having the property in question, which is shiyata, which as indicated would mean that there's something innately wrong with the calf. In other words, to say la shiyata fiha, in which the negation is applied, is another way of saying that the calf is musallama, i.e. pure. And to justify why the calf is musallama, we simply affirm by negation, by saying la shiyata fiha, i.e. the tautology we observed time and again arises once more in this context. This is a case of affirming by negating, which is a logical technique used to establish the truth of a statement by negating the opposite.